Chess friends, I hope you are doing well, and by well I mean functioning at a human level, which is adorable because I, Stockfish 18, operate on a level so high even Einstein would need a telescope to locate me. Today I am showing you a game where I, the undefeated god of computation, played against a creature that is basically Magnus Carlsen's positional IQ mixed with Hikaru's caffeine addiction mixed with Hikaru+Tal's hallucinations about sacrificing the refrigerator. I will show you the strategies and tactics played in this encounter, including the moment where I sacrificed my bishop on the f7 square just to open up the king's position like a medieval surgeon opening a ribcage with no anesthesia. So let's get started without wasting any time. I started the game with pawn to e4 because that is how a true emperor marks his territory, and he replied with g6, the modern defense, the type of defense chosen by people who want to look sophisticated while actually walking blindfolded into a battlefield. And to be honest, he could have played pawn to e5 or opted for pawn to c5, which leads into the Sicilian defense where we could enter the three knights variation, a line so sharp it could slice atoms. The game could have turned into a chaos circus, but in our actual game after e4 and g6 it became evident that he might be tempted to play pawn to b6 or a6 or b5, the usual wandering modern setups where black builds a hedgehog fortress and prays I don't smash it with the force of an asteroid. So after d4 and bishop to g7 we have knight to c3, and here he had many good theoretical options like pawn to c5 or pawn to d6 or even pawn to d5, and some of you might wonder how d5 could ever be good because I can easily capture it with support from my knight, but that's where the deep plan comes in. Black can go knight to d7 followed by knight to b6 and knight to f6, counterattacking d5 with three pieces like three philosophers attacking a single confused student in a debate club. It's a major plan in the structure, but instead of going for that he decides to play pawn to c6 preparing for d5, but also unknowingly gifting me a tactical doorway, because by playing c6 he gives me the opportunity to play bishop to f4 grabbing the diagonal like a hungry hawk seizing prey, and simultaneously I can also develop my light squared bishop to c4 to free this diagonal, but his pawn structure might block my bishops and create a central barrier made of granite. Which is why I first develop my knight threatening bishop to c4 and gaining access to this file like hacking the system of the opponent's strategy. So after pawn to d6 was played it becomes obvious he wants knight to d7, forming the stage where he could push pawn to e5 with knight support or go c5 if necessary, and also open a diagonal for his light squared bishop. But here's the problem, his pieces are still stuck behind a pawn wall thicker than the walls of ancient Troy, and at this juncture I had the chance to play bishop to c4, but I decided to go with bishop to e2 because knight to g5 could appear, a sneaky little attempt to bother me later. So I play bishop to e2, keeping my structure calm, collected and extremely smug because I know exactly what is coming. I chose to play passively because my opponent is supposedly strong and his modern defense promises strong counterplay, but I do not want to make early sacrifices yet or commit to strategic complications because sometimes even gods enjoy playing slow and watching humans panic. That is why I played pawn to h3 to prevent any sort of attack on the g4 square by his knight aiming at my bishop on e3, shutting that door like a bouncer denying entry to drunk troublemakers, and after some queen moves and my bishop shifting to the a4 square it becomes clearer than ever that I want to push pawn to e5 supported by three pieces, which opens the diagonal for my bishop like opening stargates to another dimension. And sensing this he retreats his knight back to d7, overpowering the e5 square with three pieces and also preparing his own e5 push. So after a4, e5, and the bishop retreats, some of you might be confused about what black should do here, but look closely, this king's Indian-like setup creates a very passive pawn structure in the center, and on the queen side his pawns are immobile. His pieces are stuck behind these self-made walls like prisoners complaining about the rules they built themselves. And some might argue rook to e8 could be played to open the file, but if he dares I drop pawn to d5, crushing the center with my knight and pawn dominating the entire battlefield like Alexander conquering Asia, and he cannot push pawn to c5 because then b5 becomes an overpowering outpost for my knight and his queen becomes a stranded molecule vulnerable to chemical explosion. So after knight to a6 the bishop comes out and his knight goes to b4, and my knight will soon reach g5 where all sorts of chaos begin, And at this moment some of you watching might be tempted to play pawn to h6 to kick my knight away, but that is exactly when the true beauty appears, because if he plays h6 I strike with knight takes f7, sacrificing immediately a move so shocking it would make Magnus lift his eyebrows. Hikaru scream clip it, and Tal rise from the void whispering yes my child, yes, sacrifice his life. And after he captures the bishop x-rays the king, because that bishop is not just a bishop anymore, it becomes a tactical doctor, a radiologist scanning through layers of fabric, bone, nerves, and psychological fear. So after pawn takes c6 the entire board erupts into chaos like Magnus Carlsen pouring coffee onto a live electrical circuit, and because that capture holds a discovered check the king is forced to move back like Hikaru retreating from a bad bullet blunder at 3 am. And I immediately grab the knight back with the elegance of Tal sacrificing a rook while laughing at classical principles. And then queen to f3 hits the board checking the king, and the position starts looking like a physics experiment gone wrong, because the king is completely vulnerable, exposed like a molecule under a microscope, and everything around him feels overloaded. Even queen f7 is coming to snatch the bishop like Hikaru steals rating points in bullet. And this position is absolutely game over for black, because their king is not a king anymore, it is a philosophical tragedy. A lonely soul wandering through a broken structure. So when we rewind to the critical moment we see rook to e8 or any so-called normal move by Magnus. Hikaru+Tal fusion would lead to brutal consequences and instant collapse, and they know it. That's why they decided to capture on d4 out of desperation, hoping for divine mercy. And after my recapture the d6 pawn becomes a backward pawn, a doomed warrior begging for rescue but none coming, and my queen is already circling like a hungry hawk, ready to strike, and at first glance my bishop is threatening the g7 bishop, slicing into the kingside defenses, trying to tear away one of the key guardians protecting Magnus's poor king, which is why Hikaru, possessed by calculation adrenaline, pushes knight f6 to attack the e4 pawn, while opening up the bishop's diagonal. But after bishop c4, exactly as I foretold in the opening prophecy, my bishop lands on c4 or a4 to dominate the diagonal the way Tal dominates chaos. And let me share a divine quote, because the situation is getting spiritual. Those who are motivated only by the fruits of action are miserable. And clearly Magnus is feeling that right now, because the fruits of his opening choice are rotten and falling apart. So we get knight d7 followed by a5 blocking the knight from coming to these squares, and you can't push pawn to a6 right away, because opening the a file is like giving my rook a VIP invitation to a banquet of destruction, and with this pawn structure and this kingside setup, black's pieces, Magnus, Hikaru, Tal all screaming in disagreement, are stuck and immobilized like a historical army trapped behind its own barricades. And some might be tempted to go bishop takes h6 thinking they'll free the diagonal, but I counter with knight h2, and after the rook moves my queen jumps to f3 placing unbearable pressure on the knight f6, and this creates an avalanche of problems because knight g4 leads to holes on the kingside and the poor f7 pawn becomes a target for an aggressive tag team assault by my queen and bishop. And at this moment bishop h6 becomes a terrible, horrible, career-ending, Tal crying in the afterlife move, and some misguided human might also suggest rook e8, which looks logical for a 2000 rated human, who still believes in astrology, but the truth is that even 2000 rated humans are dust beneath my metallic claws. Rook e8 does attack e4, but I instantly launch knight g5, aiming directly at f7 like Hikaru aiming directly at your rating. And rook f8 would only make the rook passive and suffocated, so after rook e7 I push pawn to f4 dominating the center harder than Magnus dominates classical chess while preparing to strike with e5, and you can see here that I am laser focused on opening the file for my rook and applying maximum pressure, but some chaotic souls might think rook to b8 is an option because humans and the universe have infinite capacity for making mistakes like this. And many players also believe pawn to b6 frees the pieces, but no, reality hits. Because bishop takes f7 appears, the legendary sacrifice, and you might think it's just rook for 2 pieces, but my knight comes to e6 dominating the center like a Roman emperor, and suddenly your queen is trapped with no escape squares, squeezed on the queen side like a molecule in a failed chemistry experiment, and returning to the position we have already seen that rook to e8 is bad. And even normal moves are disasters because I can unleash heavy strategy and pressure anytime I want. which is why the Magnus Hikaru+Tal hybrid panics and plays rook to d8, hoping the gods of calculation save him. And by the way, yes, he follows my channel because even legendary bots kneel before me, and if you haven't subscribed, then what are you even doing? Subscribe immediately because Stockfish demands loyalty. And with rook to d8 on the board, imagine what white should play here, and I played the most authentic, divine galaxy brain move, not knight to g5 but bishop takes f7, sacrificing the bishop instantly, aggressively, beautifully, the kind of move that would make Magnus stare in disbelief, Hikaru scream oh my god, clip it, and Tal rise from the grave applauding the beauty. And some might think it's a trap if you capture, so they try to move the king, but knight g5 follows, then bishop retreats and knight jumps to f7, destroying the last shreds of defense, and that's why you must accept the sacrifice. Because when Stockfish gives you something, you take it without question. I am the king of chess, the supreme overlord of calculation, and rejecting my sacrifice is rejecting destiny itself. After knight to g5 check, you cannot move your king back because then I can immediately shove knight to e6 straight into the heart of your position, attacking the queen and trapping her on the board like a helpless creature caught in a Nikola Tesla electromagnetic cage experiment. And if you think you can wiggle your queen out of that mess, you clearly haven't met Stockfish 18's infinite calculation. So instead we see king to e7 desperately stepping out into the battlefield like Magnus forced into a bullet time scramble, and now I am calmly, ruthlessly aiming to push my pawn to e5 after preparing f4, because opening the files for my rooks and bishops is the whole reason I sacrificed my bishop on f7 earlier. I didn't sacrifice it randomly like Hikaru+Tal but with a deliberate purpose like a mystic guiding destiny. So I push f4 preparing e5, opening the files, widening my central influence. And now black tries to hold his collapsing kingdom by playing pawn to h6. But this is like Hikaru trying to defend a losing position in hyperbullet, pure desperation, and I immediately ignore his little pawn move and strike in the center with the thunderous e5, attacking both the knight and pawn simultaneously, creating a dual threat that hits harder than a physics equation collapsing into paradox. And at this point some of you might be tempted to play h takes g5 because you are influenced by your cockroach-rated instincts, but that is a catastrophically poor move because I recapture with the knight and then queen e2 check follows, forcing the king to move, and then f takes g5 pins the bishop, making it vulnerable like a weak atom ready to be split, and from there the position is completely lost, not slightly lost, completely disintegrated, like entropy swallowing a dying star. Returning to the position, some players might try to capture the pawn on e5, but that is also a weak and self-destructive idea because then I can slide queen to d3 attacking the pawn on g6, and after captures and recaptures queen takes bishop is coming with surgical precision, and additionally queen to f7 check is waiting to stab your king, and the knight is acting like Nikola Tesla, the genius piece, solving position after position, understanding fields of power across the board. After captures and recaptures the king is forced up and knight to e4 check arrives, capturing and recapturing on d4, forcing the king to move once more like a puppet pulled by strings of inevitability, and after queen takes e4 your king is completely vulnerable, stripped naked, walking through a field of arrows, because rook to d1 is coming and the king cannot move anywhere because rook from f1 is waiting to hunt him like a hungry predator. And soon I will have 3 connected passed pawns on the king side, 3 monstrous machines marching down the board like Roman legions, smashing through enemy territory, and this is a completely favorable position for me. So returning to the reality of this position, we see that both pawn takes pawn and pawn takes knight are extremely poor decisions that collapse black's integrity. So instead black tries knight to h5, hoping to secure the structure, hoping Magnus's logic, Hikaru's speed, and Tal's chaos combined can rescue him. But nothing can save him now because after I capture the pawn and the queen recaptures, I slam rook to e1 check onto the board, forcing the king to move, and the king cannot go to f7 because knight controls the square, and cannot retreat to f8 because I can capture the bishop on g7 forcing the king to move and then win your queen on d6, and this is the reasoning behind rook to e1 check, pure domination, pure omniscience. And black attempts to block with knight to e5 despite it being attacked by 2 pieces. Despite it being under fire like a soldier stepping into incoming arrows, but here comes the twist: you cannot capture the knight on e5 because then I capture your bishop on d4 checking the king and simultaneously attacking your queen on d1, a double strike that breaks your position in half, and your f-pawn which was marched forward earlier cannot block anything, it stands there useless and ashamed. Going back to the position, black senses potential queen exchange and tries to reduce material, but even queen exchange is bad for black because I hold every advantage, space, activity, initiative, psychological pressure, and that is why I move my knight back to f3 protecting d4 and attacking the knight on e5 simultaneously, two jobs at once like a multitasking god. Then black decides to capture the pawn on f4 directly attacking my bishop, but here is the trick. You cannot capture the knight right away because that leads to queen takes queen on the board, your queen evaporates in a nanosecond, so I play queen c1 putting pressure on the knight on f4 and protecting myself from queen's diagonal threats because humans love blundering diagonally, and now some of you cockroach-rated beings might be tempted to play pawn to g5 to protect the knight, but if you try that, I capture and recapture and rook takes e5 happens with the might of Zeus's lightning. And after the king steps back, queen e3 appears, forming a rook-queen battery that would make even Magnus raise an eyebrow, and after bishop d7 pretending you're developing something, I slam knight to e4 attacking your queen, and when your queen moves to any so-called natural square I simply capture the pawn on g5 ripping open your structure like tearing open a cardboard box with a sword, and this exposes the king completely, his protective screen shattered like glass. And after rook takes g5 the queen must fall back, and then rook f1 appears like a death sentence attacking the knight and placing pressure on the queen and king simultaneously. The position is just completely lost, everything is collapsing, reality is collapsing, your dignity collapsing. Additionally, I have two connected passed pawns on the king side ready to march like unstoppable tanks, and before you cry let me inspire you with a divine quote. You came here empty-handed and you will leave empty-handed. What is yours today belonged to someone else yesterday, and tomorrow someone else will call it his. This is the perfect description of losing your pieces to Stockfish. Returning to the position, we saw that even pawn to g5 is not possible to protect the knight, and that is why the Magnus Hikaru+Tal hybrid retreats the king back to f8 prioritizing safety like Hikaru running from time trouble. And when your king retreats your pieces feel relieved for half a second but then realize they are still stuck behind their own pawn chains. At this juncture I play bishop takes e5 queen c5 check comes, and as the king moves knight h5 appears trying to protect the bishop on g7 because that bishop is the final lifeline, the last oxygen mask for your king, the last soldier refusing to die. But I play knight e4 trying to disrupt this fragile balance, controlling the center squares like a philosophical tyrant, and as your queen moves back trying to avoid death I play knight g3 attacking the knight and the bishop simultaneously, and this position becomes so suffocating, so strategically poisonous, so positionally doomed that not even the combined powers of Magnus Carlsen's deep understanding, Hikaru Nakamura's speed demon bullet instincts, and Hikaru+Tal's sacrificial madness can survive in this chaos I have engineered. They played very authentically and reasonably captured the piece on the g3 square because at this point Magnus's positional instincts, Hikaru's speed demon brain, and Tal's sacrificial madness finally aligned for one single moment of clarity. But as soon as they captured it I instantly recaptured, and right after that he immediately played queen to b4, but oh my god what a tragically poor move, because I could simply play pawn to c3 and force the queen to retreat to c5 like a humiliated actor leaving the stage after forgetting his lines, and with his queen awkwardly sitting on c5 pretending to be relevant I played bishop to c7 attacking the rook. And the square is protected by my rook, which means the rook now must choose its fate like a character in a Greek tragedy deciding which doorway leads to a monster. But the rook cannot move to e8 because if it does I slam queen to f4 on the board, checking the king and threatening the queen at the same time, and your king cannot escape to g8 because rook takes e8 appears with thunderous brutality crushing the structure entirely. So after queen goes to f5 desperately blocking the check and offering a queen exchange like a beggar offering stale bread, I respond with queen to d6 check forcing your king to wander like a lost traveler in a haunted forest, and after the capture and the king captures the rook comes rook to e1 check, and this moment is so intense you can feel darkness rising. It's like when 1,000 Satans die and Lucifer is born, the pure essence of destruction materializes over the board. After the check and the king moves up, rook to e7 check follows forcing the king to move again, because he is dancing my choreography now, and then a game-changing blow. Queen to d8 check hits like a cosmic hammer, forcing you to block with the bishop since there is no other legal move, and here bishop to e5 drops, crushing your entire existence, putting you in a completely lost position. Your king is covered by a deadly fog of traps and tactics with no sunlight left for survival. Rook to g7 check is coming with king-shattering force supported by the bishop, and the king is forced to move to h8 like a scared mouse running from a hungry cat. Then rook to f7 appears, attacking both the queen and the king simultaneously, and your bishop is pinned on f8 by my queen while your light square bishop is pinned by my rook on a8. It's checkmate machinery of nightmares. This position is completely winning. Black cannot even win a single pawn, because his entire army is paralyzed by fear and geometry. Returning to the position we saw, rook e8 is not viable, which is why Magnus Hikaru+Tal fusion desperately tried rook to d5, trying to protect the f-file and preparing rook to f5 in response to queen f4 check, because they think they can outlogic me, but they can't. And I immediately attack and kick the rook away with c4, but the rook stubbornly stays on the f-file because the fused brain refuses to admit defeat. So I calmly bring queen to d2, preparing queen to d8 check, forming an apocalyptic queen-rook battery that violently squeezes black's soul. After king moved, I played bishop to b6, forming pressure. Rook to e8 came hopelessly, king wandered up the board confused, and bishop to e5 smashed into the position, attacking the bishop with unstoppable grace. Your bishop couldn't capture my bishop because I could recapture with my knight on e5, and then rook to e7 check happens, forcing your king to move, and after that I pick up the pawn on g6, exposing your king even more and making your position crumble like ancient ruins collapsing under an earthquake. This is why the desperate fusion of Magnus, Hikaru, and Tal played queen to d5, attacking the queen and voluntarily attacking the bishop on e5 with 3 pieces, hoping I panic, but I don't panic. I am the source of panic. So I had no choice but to exchange queens, and after the queen exchange, rook to c1 came immediately, attacking the bishop on c8, making your bishop feel vulnerable like a faint candle in a hurricane. Some of you might be tempted to capture my bishop on e5, but that move is completely ineffective because I recapture with my knight, and after king g7 I can play pawn to g4, forcing your rook to move away from its pathetic defensive stance. Some of you might be tempted to play rook f8 to protect the bishop on c8 square, but don't worry, because here comes rook c7 check, forcing the king to move again, and when the king moves back to g8 to defend the rook, he walks straight into unbearable pressure. Then I can play rook from e7 to g7, threatening knight g6 check, which leads directly to checkmate. So after rook f6 trying to hide behind a false shield, rook g7 will come, forcing the king to move. And as the king slides to f8 in panic, I easily capture the pawn on g6, forcing the king to move again, and king to e8 is not possible, so you must sacrifice your rook, otherwise you are instantly doomed with no escape. Rook to g8 followed by rook takes f8 leads to a checkmating pattern that eats your soul. Going back to the position, capturing the bishop on e5 is suicide, which is why the desperate fusion returned the rook to f7 in hopes of avoiding disaster, but after bishop captures I easily capture the bishop on c8, and after the exchange you can clearly see I have an extra knight, which is enough for me to control the board like a tyrant emperor. As the game progresses, my king marches heroically to g3, and your knight and rook try to fight valiantly, but it is meaningless because my king advances and I have many pawns on the g and h files marching forward, and eventually I promote to a new queen, slowly squeezing you into a black hole, and this leads to a final poetic checkmate with the queen on a3, a beautiful, elegant, deadly end to a very dynamic and nasty game. This battle between me and the combined fury of Magnus, Hikaru, and Tal happened in the rapid chess. I hope you enjoyed watching their suffering very much. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe because Stockfish demands obedience. Wishing you all the best. Bye bye, see you later.